Michael Coard, who is the founding member of ATAC, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, which is local here in Philadelphia and well known nationally for what it has done to convince, coerce, compel the federal government to memorialize 9 Africans who were enslaved by George Washington when he was dwelling in his home, which is considered the first White House over there on 6th and Market, next to what is now the new Liberty Bell Center. Michael likes to describe himself as not just a lawyer who happens to be a black man, but a black man who happens to be an attorney. He also describes himself as the angriest African man in America, which is a reference to what James Baldwin said back in the days of the Harlem Renaissance, back in the 1920s, when he said, to be black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. We're here, we all believe very strongly that Black Lives Matter, and we want you to tell us more about that and about what ATAC does. So
thank you very much. Before I begin, let's give Maureen a round of applause. The best introductions I've ever heard. She kind of did it like a jazz artist. It's kind of improvised, and that worked out very well. Maybe I should stand over here. Maybe that's the best place so that everybody can see and hear what I'm going to say. I guess I'm going to talk for maybe about 10, 15 minutes, and I'd like to have you all either add some comments or ask some questions. I want to start out by saying, usually when there's an event dealing with police brutality and the racist criminal justice system, it's usually predominantly black and very few white people join in. It's a wonderful thing for you all to invite me, especially since I'm going to talk primarily about racism and police brutality and racism in the criminal justice system. I'm the type of black man, or as Maureen said, African, I like that better, African, that understands that the only way that any real change is going to come in regard to racism is for black folks to have white allies, because we just can't do it ourselves. One of the greatest steps toward ending slavery was obviously great stuff that Denmark Vesey did, and Gabriel Prosser did, and Nat Turner did, and Harriet Tubman did, and all those folks. But also just as important is what John Brown did. Right. Because if white folks really want to end racism, they have to play an active role, not just by coming in a paternalistic kind of way to the black community and offer them a hand up, but to go back to their own neighborhoods, their own churches, their own synagogues, their own whatever, and try to, and even at their own dinner table, because that's the only way any real change is going to be made. Having said that, let me say this, and what I always do when I talk to folks, I kind of lay out the problems first, but I don't just lay them out and leave. I lay out the problems, try to offer some solutions, because we pretty much know generally what the problems are. We might not know the specific problems, but we know generally what they are. So I'm not going to come here and just rehash that and just leave. I'm hoping that after this discussion, after this dialogue, this conversation, maybe even a debate, that we all have some information, or better stated, some ammunition to go out and do the right thing. I was hoping that since I put tonight's program on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, that it would be standing room only, and that we'd be having people lined up around the block. But obviously that's not the case. But I've been an activist for a very long time, and I first learned this when I was a student at Cheney University, that every revolutionary or progressive or liberal movement is never started by the masses. It's always an enlightened few that tries to light a fire to bring other people in. So we have this army here, this little army here, but an army nonetheless. Let me first start by saying, many people, when they hear me talk about racism, they say, well, Mike, I hear you complaining about racism and police brutality and racism in the criminal justice system and racism in housing and racism in education, but this is 2015. You people got a black president. You people got some black governors. You people got a black senator. And right here in Philadelphia, you people got a black mayor, a black police commissioner, black city council president, black DA, black sheriff. So you made it. What Dr. King talked about in terms of us overcoming, we've been there. We've overcome, so everybody's happy, no more racism, we'll sing Kumbaya, hold hands, and be happy. But nothing could be further from the truth, because even though we have people like Barack Obama and the mayor and all those other people and a billionaire Oprah Winfrey, this is the question I pose to people who say, because of all that, and not just the election of Barack Obama, but the re-election of Barack Obama, they say that we're in this post-racial society. And there are good, well-intentioned white people who say that. And I listen and I ask them a question. I say, look, everything you said is true about Oprah, about Barack Obama, about the mayor, about city council, all that stuff. But if tomorrow you had to go to court as a defendant in a criminal case, and you could choose to go as a white defendant or a black defendant, which one would you choose? If it's 3 o'clock in the morning and there's lights and sirens behind you and a cop pulls you over, and as that cop approaches you, you could be a black driver or a white driver. Which one would you choose? Well, the answer is obvious. It's a rhetorical question, so we're not in this post-racial society. So what are we going to do about it? And just recently, a great discussion has been sparked about racism as a result of a horrific tragedy. We know what happened in South Carolina. We know what's going on with the Confederate flag. We know all of that stuff, but what's the solution to it? As corny as it sounds, the solution is each individual person. But before I get into that, let me just go into some background, because those who say we're in that post-racial society, when I make my argument about if you had to be a defendant, would you choose black or white? If you're stopped by a cop, would you choose black or white? They hear that, and to me, that's the most persuasive argument. But then folks who are resistant to change, they are going to kind of shut down. They need more evidence. They say, well, look, last time I checked, the 13th Amendment became law in 1865, and here we are in 2015. So that's about, what, 150 years of freedom for black people. But that's not really true, because you look at it this way. The first documented case of so-called slavery in America happened in what's now Virginia on August 20, 1619. So if we start the clock of slavery in America at 1619 and we end it with the 13th Amendment in 1865, that's, I don't know, 300, let me go to my notes. I did the math, and I got a couple, and I'd like you all to write this down because it's a persuasive argument. Let's do it this way. Let's have 1865 and 1619. So if we subtract 1619 from 1865, we come up with 246. So people say, okay, slavery began August 20, 1619, ended with the 13th Amendment in 1865. That's 246 years. And before I go to my next numbers, let me just say this. Slavery didn't end with the 13th Amendment. Many people never even read the 13th Amendment. And even before I get into that, let's talk about Abe Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. No disrespect to Mr. Lincoln, but that document was not worth the paper it was written on. Because it basically was like the president of France freeing people in Germany. Well, France has no jurisdiction over Germany. And when Abe Lincoln so-called freed the slaves, he did that in a separate country, the Confederate States of America. So he had no jurisdiction over them, and plus, he didn't even free the ones in the border states. So that whole Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't emancipate anybody, but it was a shrewd political move. It was a shrewd PR stunt. So we go from the Emancipation Proclamation to the 13th Amendment. So even that first document, that even today, 2015, people are looking at the Emancipation Proclamation and still calling Abe Lincoln the great emancipator. That's how we describe him. And again, I have to admit, he did some good stuff, but you'd be shocked to know that Abe Lincoln was a racist. I mean, by his own words, he said that, yeah, I'll stop these people from being slaves, but they can't vote, they can't hold elected office, they can't marry us, they can't do any of that stuff. So, but that's a whole separate thing. Lerone Bennett, the publisher of Ebony Magazine, does a great article, a great book about the racist hypocrisy of Abe Lincoln. But I'm not going to beat up on Abe Lincoln. I'm going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation that didn't free anybody because Abe Lincoln had no jurisdiction of the people that he claimed to free. Plus, he allowed slavery to continue in the border states as long as, anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked. Abe Lincoln is not the worst of this. So we got the Emancipation Proclamation that supposedly frees black folks, doesn't. Let's jump to the 13th Amendment. If you read it, it says slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, and then in small print, unless following the conviction of a crime. So what did that mean? That means instead of white people kidnapping blacks and enslaving them, they simply arrested blacks and convicted them. Because if you convict them, now you can force them to go to these penal colonies, and not just penal colonies. The same plantation that Big Jim was forced to labor on before the 13th Amendment, after he goes to jail because of some trumped up charges, now he's leased back to that same plantation. So slavery really didn't end with the 13th Amendment in 1865. So if it didn't end, and let's just again do the math. So we got 1865, 1619, 246 years. So people say if that 1865 date is correct, and we're in 2015 now, that's 150 years. So you black folks were enslaved for 246 years, but you've been free for 150 years. But it's really not true, because the calendar, the clock goes from 1619 to 1964, not 1865. Why 1964? Because that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we have 1619, beginning of slavery, 1964, the end of slavery, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's 345 years. Now, why did I use 1964? Because with that Civil Rights Act, finally, that gave some teeth to what the 13th Amendment was supposed to stand for. But even with that, black folks still have problems, because this is how things work. We had slavery, and after slavery, we had convict leasing. Convict leasing simply meant that instead of legally enslaving them, you arrested them on trumped up charges, you had a kangaroo court trial, you convicted them, and now you gave them 5 years, and they got to work at that same cotton plantation, that same coal mine, that same tobacco plantation, under the same so-called slave master. There's a great documentary called Slavery by Another Name, and it's available 24/7 on the pbs.org website. And that documentary, Slavery by Another Name, it's tragic and horrific, because it showed how after so-called slavery ended, so now you don't have the slave codes anymore. Now you have the black codes. And the black codes were laws designed to put the recently freed black people back into a state of slavery. They would make up laws like the pig laws, because black people were forced to eat pig slop and chitlins and all that kind of stuff during slavery, so they developed, for some reason, for that reason, affinity to it. So now the law was these hungry, former enslaved people, and by the way, I call them formerly enslaved, or I call them enslaved, not slaves. And I specifically don't call them slaves because last time I checked, there's no country in Africa called slave. So when people say they brought slaves out of Africa, that's not true. They brought Ghanaians out of Africa. They brought Senegalese out of Africa. They brought Liberians. They did all of that kind of stuff. So they are human beings who were plumbers and carpenters and teachers and doctors and lawyers who simply didn't have enough firepower to repel the Europeans. So they were kidnapped and subjugated. So we go from 1619 to 1865. 1865, you can't enslave them anymore, but you can convict them. And once you convict them, you can force them to go back to the plantation, because first the county was making money off of them, but they realized that they could lease these people to their former so-called masters. And by the way, people often accuse me of speaking too fast, and I accuse them of listening too slow. So if you speed up your listening, we'll be on the same page. So anyway, 1865, we can't have the slave codes anymore because the 13th Amendment, quote unquote, abolished slavery. But we can have something called the black codes, which means new laws designed to penalize black people specifically. Similar to what was going on with the whole crack thing and powder cocaine thing, where you make it a longer prison sentence for smoking crack than you do for using the same cocaine, but in a powder form. But anyway, so laws like the pig laws. So if you're a hungry black person and steal a pig to eat, it's a mandatory 5 years in prison, or 5 years on the plantation, or whatever it is. But it wasn't just the pig laws. There was the railroad law. And the railroad law basically said that if a black person was caught within a certain number of yards of a railway line, he would be arrested and convicted. I figured, what's wrong with being near a railway line? Well, black people weren't stupid. They were hopping trains in the South to get to the North. So they made that law. There was also a very weird law called the White Woman Hollering Law. The White Woman Hollering Law. What was that law? That was a law that said that black people, primarily black men, were not permitted to raise their voice in the presence of white women. And I jokingly say that's why every time I'm in Center City, Philly, I just yell anytime I can when I see white women. But that's a joke. Let me move on. But my point is, so we got the pig law, we got the runaway return law, we got the the railroad law, and I just mentioned the runaway return law. Let me just move away from this for a second. I'm going to come back to this whole black codes thing. When we look at American history, from its very foundation, it's racist. And people wonder why there's racism today, and the answer is because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Forget about what was done to the original inhabitants here, the so-called Indians, so-called Native Americans. The proper term is Ankwe Hongwe, but the original people here, let's put that to the side because that's a horrific tragedy in and of itself. But let's start the racist calendar for the sake of our discussion with slavery. You had 56 white male property owners who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. 56 white male property owners signed the Declaration of Independence, and 1/3 of them owned black people as slaves. So the founding fathers not only endorsed slavery, but many of them were so-called slave owners themselves. That's 1776. Fast forward to the U.S. Constitution, 1789. The U.S. Constitution, supposedly a great document, just like the Declaration of Independence, a racist document. And one thing I do want to say before I jump to the Constitution, there was language in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence that condemned slavery because King George in Britain was enslaving people and capturing people. And then somebody among the founding fathers, 56, said, I think we should take that stuff out about the whole slavery thing. Because if we point the finger at King George, it's going to come right back to us. So they deleted that. So, but that was in the original draft. That shows the hypocrisy of the original, the first document of this new country. That's Declaration of Independence. Fast forward 1789 to this Constitution. 3 clauses in the Constitution blatantly racist. The first one was the 3/5 clause. And basically it said that black people were to be counted for census purposes, not as a full human being, but as a partial human being, a subhuman being, 3/5. And when I talk to certain people about this, they say to me, Mike, you're missing the point. That 3/5 clause was actually good for black people because it was a compromise. The South wanted to be able to count every black person that was enslaved because that would increase their population and therefore they would have more representation in Congress because you get as many representatives based on the number of people you have in your state, in your district. So they wanted to count, say, 1 million people, even though 500,000 are white and free and the other half are black and enslaved. The South wanted to count each one of those to make them have 1 million. Now they have 3, 4, 5, 6 representatives in Congress and more power. The North said, no, you can't count them at all. So the North said, no, you can't count them at all. The South said we wanted to count them 100%. So the compromise was 3/5. We're not going to count all these enslaved people for purposes of getting representation in Congress, but it's going to be 3/5. And people say, well, Mike, that's good. Because if you think about it, if they had been able to count blacks as 100% human, as you wanted them to, there would have been more people in the South, they would have had more representation, more power in Congress, and there would have been no end to slavery. That seems to make sense on the surface, but when you look deeper, I say, okay, if this 3/5 concept makes sense in regard to counting them for purposes of political representation, apply it across the board. Let black people off 3/5 of the week. Give them 3/5 of the wages. Let them vote in 3/5 of the elections. So you got to be consistent. So that first clause in the Constitution, 3/5, blatantly racist. on its face. The next one was the runaway return clause. Remember, this is in the Constitution, the law of the land. It said, if a black person was fortunate and lucky enough to escape a free state or to escape a slave state or a slave territory and get to a free state or free territory, the U.S. Constitution mandated that they be sent back into slavery. That's what the Constitution said. And then, so you had the Three-Fifths Clause, the Runaway Return Clause, and a few other clauses that dealt specifically with keeping black people subjugated in a slavery condition. Let's go from that, and I want to go back to my calendar here, my chronology. So we started off with 1865, 1619, and we agreed 246 years. And we say, okay, if slavery ended in 1865, it's now 2015, that's 150 years of freedom. I say no, it's really from 1619 to 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that's 345 years. So if you look at 2015, 1964, black people have been free for only about 51 years. Think about that. 51 years. So when you look at the fact that we got this black president and these black, here in Philadelphia, black mayor, black city council president, black all that stuff, I mean, we've done quite a bit as black people during that 51-year period, but it's not enough. Why? Because of the question I posed at the very beginning. If you had to go to court as a black person or white person, which would you choose? If you were stopped by the cops and could be black or white, what would you choose? If you were applying for a mortgage and you got the same credit score, the same employment, the same education, would you prefer to go into that bank as black or white? The answer is obvious, so racism is still upon us. What can we do about it? And believe it or not, I spent about 12, 13, 14 minutes talking about stuff that's leading me up to the key. The key is, when we talk about Amnesty International, we're talking about human rights. And many people talk about what a great man and a great mind Malcolm X was, but he actually was a greater man and had a greater mind than people can imagine. I mean, here's a guy who didn't really have any formal book knowledge, but he was able to just eat up books and get so much information. And in 1965, no disrespect to Dr. King, no disrespect to the NAACP, but he said something that none of them even thought about. He said that the quote, the Negro problem is not just a Negro problem. The civil rights problem is not just a civil rights problem. It's a human rights problem. So he said, instead of taking it to the same racist U.S. Supreme Court that thinks exactly like the Supreme Court did in 1857, where they said the black man has no rights, the white man is bound to respect, Malcolm said, why keep going to the same person who's oppressing you? That person's not going to stop oppressing you simply because you petition him to do so. You got to go beyond that, above that. So he said in 1965, when he spoke at a church in Rochester, New York, that black people's focus should be to take their claims to the World Court, take their claims to the UN. And he talked about the UN Declaration of Human Rights from 1945. So here you got Dr. King, you got Malcolm X. And again, I love what Dr. King stood for. And I don't want to make sure I say this the right way. Now, I respect what Dr. King stood for, but it seems that his approach was too parochial, too limited. And I hate to say that because who the hell am I to question Dr. King, a great man? But even if he had succeeded in what he was trying to do, and he did, look at where we are. I mean, we have somebody saying, and again, a great man, much more courageous than I ever could be. But he wanted us on the same buses as whites. We got that, but what did we get? He wanted us to drink from the same water fountains as whites. We got that, but what did we get? He wanted us to do all these things that whites do, but when you force people to do something and it's not in their heart, then they're really not going to do it. And sadly, too many whites really didn't want to do that. They were forced by the courts to, but my point is, I love and respect Dr. King, but his views seem to be too parochial, too limited. Malcolm X was talking about going beyond that. It's like you go to a company and you have a problem with the company, you don't just complain to the salesperson, you go to the manager, to the supervisor, to the CEO, whoever's in charge. Well, Malcolm saw the UN as in charge. So in 1965, he talked about making a human rights complaint based on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And he talked about the 30 different articles in that document, where it talks about a right to freedom, a right to liberty, and a right to due process, and all those kind of things. So now, what do we do? And I had so much more to say, but I'm running out of time, plus I want folks to ask questions and offer some comments. So what do we do now? I talked about the whole slavery thing. I talked about how it really didn't end in 1865, it really went up to 1964. I talked about all of that stuff, but what do we do about that now, today, specifically in regard to two areas? One, racist police brutality, and two, the criminal injustice system. Because that question I posed about if you could be a black defendant or a white defendant, which would you choose? That's real. I, as an attorney, I've been an attorney for more than 20 years, and in my more than 20 years, I probably had maybe, I'd say, 10 white clients accused of crime. 10 white clients accused of crime. Not one of them ever went to jail. Not one. Not one. They did some horrible stuff. But I was always able to talk, quote unquote, white talk to the judge about that. About little Johnny, that his parents were divorced, that he had a substance abuse problem, that whatever. And judges would hear that and reject it. And let me just show you the contrast. I represent some quote unquote bad people who do some bad stuff. Now, when I talked in the past in those 10 cases to white judges about white Johnny and talked about the horrible life he had and why the judge had given probation instead of jail, that resonated in the judge's head. He could relate to that, like, wow, I remember when I was a kid, I had the same problem. I represent, and still do, a guy who we just got off death row by the name of Kareem Johnson. Kareem Johnson, back in the late 1990s, was part of a drug gang. And his drug gang, another drug gang, had a shootout right in front of a schoolyard. And during the shootout, they killed Fahim Thomas Childs. 10-year-old innocent kid killed in the crossfire. My client, Kareem Johnson, was arrested for that. And before that, he was actually in jail on a minor drug case, and his cellmate was awaiting a murder trial. And supposedly the cellmate was talking to my client about getting rid of the witness who was going to testify against the cellmate. So when Kareem got out of jail in his minor drug case, supposedly he went to the area where the witness lived and shot and killed him. So he was arrested for that, and he was charged with that, and then he was charged later with the Fahim Thomas Child. My point is, you might think, wow, he killed a witness and he shot a kid during a drug war. That's horrible. When we went to trial, he was found guilty of killing the witness after having been found guilty of shooting Fahim Thomas Childs. So we went from the trial phase to what we lawyers call the mitigation phase. That's where the jury already found you guilty, and now we go to the second question, does he get life or death? And I'm from North Philly, I've been a lawyer for more than 20 years, so I'm kind of hardened to how the law works. But what I'm about to tell you actually brought tears to my eyes, because when you get to the mitigation phase, you're supposed to bring in your teachers and your basketball coach and your neighbor and your Boy Scout leader and all the stuff, your preacher, Sunday school teacher, all that stuff to talk about how you were a great person and you just made some mistakes, your employers, your teachers, all that stuff. We couldn't find anybody, not one person for Kareem Johnson to save him except his mom. And when his mom got on the witness stand, she talked about how before he was born, she was a heroin addict, she was a prostitute, she was a thief, she was an alcoholic, she had venereal disease, she had all the types of problems you can think of. And she had this while she was pregnant with Kareem. So can you imagine your mother having sex with 50 men a night while you're inside her stomach? The fact that she got venereal disease and syphilis and everything else, the fact that she's smoking crack and shooting up heroin and drinking alcohol, and you're living in poverty, and it's just the worst hell you can imagine. And she just laid out everything. And then at the end of it, she said, I know my son has done some bad things. And then she ended it by saying, but he didn't ask to come here. And to me, that was just so profound. He did not ask to come here. And she also pointed out that he left the house at 8 years old as a grown man, the way we leave the house at age 20 or 25. Because his mother wasn't there for him, so he leaves the house at age 8 and he hangs out with the wrong crowd, stealing cars, shoplifting, and graduates to become a criminal. But he didn't ask to come here. When I laid out all of that stuff to the jury about his hellish life, For those jurors, most of them were white, they were in one ear and out the other. But if he was that white kid who I explained how his white mother went through all of that stuff, all of a sudden they get like, wow, I can imagine that were me and my son. So when we look at the criminal justice system, the question is, what can we do about ending racism there? We look at the police brutality. What can we do about ending racism there? You'd be surprised to hear my answer, which is, I really don't know. I have some solutions, some proposed solutions, but none of these are etched in stone. There's so many things I want to talk to you about, but again, I don't want to take up too much time because I know you all have to do your thing after. But one of the things I want to do... Okay, thank you. You know, it's really funny because when I do my closing arguments to juries, I always tell them that it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes. But that's bullshit, pardon my language. I know it's going to be much longer, but if I tell them it's going to be 45 minutes, they're going to start dozing off. So if I tell them 15, 20 minutes, by the time I get to about 10 to 12, I'll tell them I got 10 more minutes. And then once I get to about 13 minutes, I'll tell them I got 5 more minutes. And I'll stretch it out to about 45 minutes. By the time it's over, they don't know what hit them. So I told you all like 10 to 12 minutes. I knew all along it was going to be 10 to 12 minutes. But anyway, in terms of how do we end racism in the criminal justice system? I have some solutions, and I can set one of the things that as a lawyer I'm not permitted to do is to advocate for what we lawyers call nullification. Nullification means that as a juror, you see the law, you hear the law, you see the facts, you hear the facts, but you're looking at the big picture, and you therefore find the person not guilty. Even though the facts say he did it, and even though the law says, you nullify it. As lawyers, we are not permitted to tell people to violate their oath and to nullify the law. But with a wink and a nod, I just tell people to do the right thing. So if you're a juror and you see a case like that, where, let's get back to the Kareem Johnson case. One of the things that enlightened and progressive people do is they're too honest. So when I have these death penalty cases, the court officers bring 60 people into the room. And from those 60 people, we got to choose 12 jurors, and instead of 2 alternates, we have 4 alternates in death penalty cases. When progressive white people come into the room, and it's a death penalty case, and the judge says, how many people here oppose the death penalty? All the progressive and honest white people raise their hand. They're done. They're gone now. So those 12 people, I'm like, shut the hell up and sit down. Because once they leave, you leave the Cro-Magnon people there to be on the jury and just fry people. So people say, well, Mike, I just took an oath to tell the truth, and I'm not going to lie to the judge. If I don't support the death penalty, then I have to say it. And I say, well, let me tell you what you need to do, how you need to rationalize this in your mind. Just think, if you got a call from a friend, from your spouse, and your spouse told you that a horrible tragedy happened to your infant child, that the worst thing that you can think imaginable, the worst crime, the most perverse crime, the most horrific crime, torture and brutality and all that kind of stuff was done to your infant child by the next door neighbor, and you get this call. For that split second, you want to kill that person. For that split second, you want to just strangle the person, do this horrible thing to your toddler. Well, when the judge asked if you support the death penalty, he didn't ask you how long, he didn't ask you when, he just asked you if you supported it. So just think of the worst thing that could happen to a family member and what your initial reaction would be, and for everybody, automatically, it's knee-jerk, if you want to kill the person, then you back off and you are more rational. But again, the judge didn't ask it. So I'm saying, one of the things we have to do is to think strategically, and you beat racism in the criminal justice system by getting on juries. If you get, and I just told you about the death penalty case, but what if it's not death? What if it's a drug case? I mean, I got my own personal opinion. Nobody should ever go to prison for drug use. Nobody. It just makes no sense. It's just like jailing alcoholics, because that's what a drug addict is. So the idea of putting a weed smoker or a cocaine snorter or a heroin shooter in prison is absolutely barbaric. So you can go in as a juror and you can nullify. You can say, hey, the guy was caught with 4 ounces of marijuana or 2 ounces of cocaine or whatever he was caught with. And by the way, I really am going to end this in 6 minutes. I really am, really. So 6 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up. So One of the ways that we begin to end racism in the criminal justice system is the best way to beat the system is to be a part of the system. You can have the activists outside the courthouse all day long protesting and demonstrating and raising hell, but that's not going to change anything inside the courtroom. You got to get in the courtroom, get on the juries, and when people are arrested for smoking marijuana, for snorting coke, for shooting heroin, for shoplifting from a store because they were hungry, you just got to do justice, do the right thing. And you can nullify, but I can't tell you to nullify. So the way we begin to end racism in the criminal justice system is to become part of that system, get inside, do the right thing. In terms of what we do to end racism in terms of police brutality, I took a page from the Black Panther Party's 10-point program in 1966. And in 1966, the Panthers came up with this ingenious concept of ending not only race bias, but class bias, and had 10 points. So I'm trying to figure out what we can do to end police brutality. I took that concept and applied it to what I call the 10-point platform and program to end and criminalize police brutality. I didn't bring copies with me, but I can email you all, you can circulate it. But let me just quickly run through it. So I told you about what you can do to end it in the criminal justice system. You become a part of that system by being a juror and by spreading the gospel to other progressive enlightened whites at work, at the mosque, at the synagogue, at the church, at the recreation center, and just spread the gospel until right-thinking people get into positions of power. And by the way, there's no more powerful position for an individual than to be on a jury. Voting is important, but as a juror, you can stop the United States government in its tracks. The cases are called United States of America versus John Doe. You got one of the most powerful entities on the planet, and now here you come in as a juror, and you stop that powerful entity in those criminal prosecutions. Or, in the case of state cases, you stop the Commonwealth. So get on juries, do the right thing, and tell other people to do it. In regard to police brutality, I'm going to quickly go through it because I got about 3 minutes left. It's called the 10-point platform and program to end and criminalize police brutality. It's not just a matter of stopping it, you got to put the cops in jail. Because if it just stops, that's like the idea of me being able to go to court and say, Judge, my client just promised to stop robbing people. So just let him go. He's not going to do it anymore. No, Judge's not going to hear that. He robbed 15